They thought they had found the perfect target, a quiet woman in her 30s, sitting alone at the corner table of Murphy's bar, nursing a beer and watching the football game on the overhead screen. She looked ordinary, unremarkable even. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a plain black t-shirt. No flashy jewelry, no expensive clothes, nothing that screamed military training or special operations background. The 5 young recruits had been drinking for hours, their confidence inflated by alcohol and the bravado that comes with youth. They had graduated basic training just weeks earlier, and tonight they felt invincible. When they spotted the lone woman, something dark stirred in their alcohol-clouded minds. They began to circle like predators, their intentions growing more sinister with each passing minute. What they didn't know was that Lieutenant Commander Sarah "Ghost" Martinez had earned her nickname through 8 years of the most elite military training the world had ever seen. She had survived Hell Week. She had completed missions in Afghanistan and Iraq that remained classified. She had earned the respect of the hardest men in the military, and she had saved more lives than she had ever taken. But tonight, as 5 recruits closed in on her with malicious intent, they were about to discover that some legends are very much alive, very much present, and very much capable of defending themselves. This is the true story of how 5 young men learned the hardest lesson of their military careers, and how one woman reminded everyone present that night why Navy SEALs are considered the most feared warriors on the planet. Story Part 1. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Murphy's Bar in Norfolk, Virginia, creating rivulets that caught the neon light from the beer signs and transformed them into liquid rainbows on the glass. It was the kind of November evening that made people want to stay indoors, nurse a drink, and forget about the world outside. For Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, this was exactly what she needed. She sat in the far corner booth, her back to the wall, and a clear view of both the entrance and the emergency exit. Old habits died hard, and even after 3 months of administrative leave, her training remained as sharp as the day she had graduated from BUD/S 8 years earlier. The leave wasn't her choice. A congressional hearing about a classified operation in Syria had put her career in limbo while politicians argued about oversight and accountability. She couldn't discuss the details, couldn't defend herself publicly, and couldn't return to active duty until the bureaucrats finished their performance. So she waited. And tonight, like most nights recently, she waited at Murphy's Bar. The place was exactly what it appeared to be, a no-frills military hangout 3 miles from Naval Station Norfolk. The walls were covered with unit patches, challenge coins, and photographs of sailors and Marines who had made this place their second home over the decades. The beer was cold, the food was edible, and most importantly, people minded their own business. It was the perfect place for someone who wanted to be left alone. Sarah took a sip of her Budweiser and turned her attention back to the football game on the overhead television. The Cowboys were driving toward the end zone against the Eagles, and she found herself invested in the outcome despite having no particular loyalty to either team. Football was simple. There were rules, clear objectives, and definitive outcomes. Unlike the political nightmare that had become her life, football made sense. She had chosen her seat carefully. The corner booth gave her the tactical advantage she always sought, but it also kept her away from the main flow of traffic in the bar. Most of the patrons were career military, older guys who understood the value of personal space and professional courtesy. They might nod in acknowledgement when they passed her table, but they respected the universal signal of someone who wanted to be left alone. The 5 young men who entered Murphy's at 8:37 didn't understand these unwritten rules. Sarah noticed them immediately, her peripheral vision cataloging their entry while her eyes remained focused on the television screen. 5 males, early 20s, athletic builds, fresh haircuts that screamed recent graduates of basic training. They moved with the swagger of youth and inexperience, their voices already elevated from alcohol consumed elsewhere. They wore civilian clothes, but their bearing and the way they automatically scanned the room marked them as military. New recruits, Sarah concluded, probably from one of the nearby training facilities, out celebrating their graduation and feeling invincible. She had been exactly like them once, full of confidence and eager to prove herself. The difference was that her confidence had been tempered by years of actual combat experience, while theirs was built on nothing more substantial than successfully completing an obstacle course. They claimed a large table near the center of the bar, their laughter growing louder with each round they ordered. Sarah tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the game and the peaceful solitude she had come here to find. But as the evening progressed, their behavior became increasingly difficult to overlook. It started with crude comments about the female bartender, remarks loud enough to ensure she heard them, but delivered with the kind of smirking bravado that suggested they thought they were being clever. The bartender, a professional woman in her 40s who had probably dealt with countless drunk recruits over the years, handled their behavior with practiced indifference. She served their drinks efficiently and moved on, refusing to engage with their increasingly inappropriate comments. But the recruits interpreted her professionalism as encouragement. Their voices grew louder, their gestures more animated, and their sense of entitlement more pronounced. They began making comments about other women in the bar, rating them audibly, and discussing what they would like to do to them in terms that would have resulted in immediate disciplinary action if they had been in uniform. The other patrons, mostly older military personnel, began to show signs of annoyance. Conversations quieted, and more than one man turned to look at the recruits with expressions that clearly communicated disapproval. Sarah found herself tensing despite her efforts to remain detached. She had seen this behavior before, usually in young soldiers who mistook military training for license to dominate civilians. It was the kind of toxic masculinity that gave the military a bad reputation and made life harder for the women who serve alongside them. Part of her wanted to intervene, to use her rank and experience to remind these recruits that military service was supposed to build character, not destroy it. But she was off duty, out of uniform, and technically not even on active status. More importantly, she was tired of fighting battles that weren't hers to fight. Let their commanding officers deal with their behavior. Let the bartender call security if things got out of hand. She was here to drink beer and watch football, not to provide mentorship to every punk recruit who thought his uniform made him special. The decision to remain uninvolved became harder to maintain as the evening progressed. By 9:15, the recruits had consumed enough alcohol to lower their inhibitions to dangerous levels. Their comments became more explicit, their laughter more aggressive, and their attention began to focus on specific targets rather than general crude humor. Sarah watched them through her peripheral vision, noting the way they had begun to whisper among themselves and gesture toward different women in the bar. They were hunting. The realization sent a chill down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the November rain outside. She had seen this behavior in war zones, where young soldiers sometimes interpreted their position of power as license to prey upon local civilians. It was behavior that decent officers crushed immediately and permanently because left unchecked, it escalated rapidly into serious criminal activity. These recruits had moved beyond inappropriate comments and crude humor. They were actively evaluating potential victims. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her hip, where she would normally carry her sidearm while on duty. But she was in civilian clothes at a civilian bar, and her weapon was locked in the gun safe at her apartment 20 minutes away. For the first time in years, she felt genuinely vulnerable, not because she couldn't defend herself, but because she couldn't protect others without revealing capabilities that were supposed to remain classified. Her SEAL training was not common knowledge. Her personnel file listed her as a naval intelligence officer, a cover story that had protected her real identity through 3 deployments and countless classified operations. As far as anyone at Murphy's Bar knew, she was just another off-duty officer having a quiet drink. Revealing her true capabilities would raise questions she couldn't answer and potentially compromise operations she couldn't discuss. But as she watched the 5 recruits rise from their table and begin moving through the bar with obvious predatory intent, Sarah realized that maintaining her cover might come at a cost she wasn't willing to pay. The first target they approached was a young woman sitting with 2 girlfriends near the pool table. College-aged, probably from nearby Old Dominion University, she was clearly uncomfortable as the 5 men surrounded her table and began making aggressive advances. Her friends tried to intervene, but the recruits outnumbered them and used their physical size to intimidate. Within minutes, the 3 women had gathered their purses and fled toward the exit, their evening ruined by the encounter. The recruits celebrated their victory with high fives and another round of drinks, their behavior growing bolder with each success. They had discovered that they could use their military bearing and physical presence to intimidate civilians, and the power rush was intoxicating. Their second target was a middle-aged woman sitting alone at the bar, apparently waiting for someone. She handled their advances with more experience and confidence than the college students had shown, telling them firmly to leave her alone and threatening to call the police. But instead of backing down, the recruits escalated their behavior, surrounding her bar stool and making increasingly explicit threats about what would happen to her if she didn't cooperate. This time the bartender intervened, threatening to call security and ordering the recruits to return to their table. They complied, but only after making it clear that their compliance was temporary and conditional. The woman finished her drink quickly and left without waiting for whoever she had been expecting. Sarah found herself clenching her fists as she watched the pattern develop. The recruits had discovered that they could drive women away from the bar through intimidation and threats, and they were treating it like a game. Each successful encounter made them bolder and more aggressive, and she could see the evening progressing toward something much more serious than inappropriate comments. She considered her options. She could leave, removing herself from the situation and avoiding any potential confrontation. She could call the police, though her experience suggested that by the time they arrived, the situation would have either resolved itself or escalated beyond their ability to handle. She could try to blend in with the other patrons, hoping that the recruits would eventually drink themselves into unconsciousness or be thrown out by security. Or she could stay and wait for them to make their inevitable mistake. Because Sarah had no doubt that these 5 young men were building towards something that would cross the line from harassment into assault. She had seen the pattern too many times in too many places to mistake their trajectory. They were testing boundaries, pushing limits, and working themselves up to an act that would define the rest of their lives. The question was whether that act would be committed against someone who couldn't defend herself or against someone who very much could. At 9:43, the recruits finished their assessment of available targets and reached their inevitable conclusion. The college students were gone. The middle-aged woman was gone. Most of the other women in the bar were either with larger groups or accompanied by men who looked capable of providing protection. That left Sarah, sitting alone in her corner booth, apparently absorbed in the football game, wearing clothes that suggested neither wealth nor poverty, and displaying none of the obvious warning signs that had protected other potential targets. To 5 drunk recruits looking for easy prey, she must have seemed like the perfect victim. They whispered among themselves for several minutes, their glances in her direction becoming more frequent and obvious. Sarah kept her eyes on the television screen, but her other senses were fully engaged, cataloging their positions, their movements, and their increasing agitation. She could feel the predatory focus shifting toward her like the barrel of a rifle being brought to bear on a target. She finished her beer and signaled the waitress for another, projecting an image of relaxed casualness while her mind ran through tactical scenarios. 5 opponents, all younger and probably stronger than her apparent physical capabilities would suggest. Multiple potential weapons within reach, multiple escape routes, and a room full of witnesses who would either help or hinder, depending on how the situation developed. But most importantly, 5 young men who had no idea what they were about to encounter. The football game moved into the 4th quarter, the Cowboys maintaining their lead despite a late rally by the Eagles. Sarah found herself genuinely invested in the outcome, partly as a distraction from the approaching confrontation, and partly because the structured violence of football seemed appropriate preparation for what was coming. At 9:58, the largest of the 5 recruits stood up from their table and began walking toward her booth. Sarah took a sip of her fresh beer and waited. The young man was impressive by civilian standards. 6 feet 2 inches tall, probably 220 pounds, with the kind of build that came from serious weight training and proper nutrition. His haircut was military regulation, his posture was confident, and his movement suggested someone who was accustomed to physical confrontation. Under different circumstances, Sarah might have been proud to serve alongside someone with his apparent dedication to fitness and military bearing. But as he approached her table with obvious predatory intent, She felt only sadness for the waste of potential he represented. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, already sliding into the booth across from her without waiting for permission. Sarah looked at him for the first time, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze that revealed nothing of her true thoughts or capabilities. "I do mind, actually. I'm watching the game." Her voice was calm, polite, and completely unthreatening. She might have been declining an invitation to dance at a high school prom rather than rejecting an advance from a potential predator. The recruit's confidence wavered for just a moment, as if he had expected either enthusiastic acceptance or obvious fear. "Come on, don't be like that," he said, recovering his swagger. "I'm just being friendly. Name's Derek. I just graduated from basic training at Great Lakes. Shipping out to my first assignment next week." Sarah turned her attention back to the television screen. "Congratulations. Good luck with your career." The dismissal was clear and unambiguous, delivered in a tone that suggested the conversation was over. But Derek had not come to her table to be dismissed. He had come as the advanced scout for his friends, and returning empty-handed would damage his reputation within their group. "You know, you shouldn't sit alone in a place like this," he continued, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there before. "A lot of rough characters come through here. You could use some protection." Sarah almost smiled at the transparent threat disguised as concern. It was such a classic predator move that it could have been lifted from a textbook on criminal psychology. Identify a vulnerable target, create a sense of danger, then position yourself as the solution to the problem you've created. "I'm fine, thank you," she said without looking away from the game. Derek's confidence cracked a little further. His friends were watching from across the room, and he was failing to make progress with what should have been an easy target. Sarah could sense his frustration building, could feel the moment approaching when polite rejection would no longer be sufficient to deter him. "Look, lady, I'm trying to be nice here," he said, his voice dropping to a more threatening tone. "But you're being pretty rude. Maybe you need someone to teach you some manners." Now, Sarah did look at him, and for just a moment, she allowed a hint of her true nature to show in her eyes. It was the look of someone who had killed enemy combatants with her bare hands, someone who had survived firefights in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, someone who had earned the respect of the hardest men in the military through demonstrated competence under fire. Derek saw that look and involuntarily leaned back, his predatory confidence replaced by something approaching genuine concern for his own safety. For a split second, he glimpsed the reality of what he was dealing with, and his primitive survival instincts screamed warnings that his conscious mind couldn't quite process. But the moment passed, and his alcohol-fueled bravado reasserted itself. After all, he was a trained military professional surrounded by 4 friends who shared his capabilities. Whatever he had seen in this woman's eyes, it couldn't possibly represent a genuine threat to his safety. "You know what?" Derek said, standing up from a booth. "I think you need some time to reconsider your attitude. My friends, and I will be right over there when you're ready to be more social." The threat was implicit but unmistakable. He was giving her time to change her mind voluntarily before they escalated to more direct methods of persuasion. Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his words while her mind continued its tactical analysis. 5 opponents, spread across the room, but in visual contact with each other. Multiple civilians in the area who could be caught in crossfire if things went kinetic. Limited space for maneuvering, but numerous potential weapons and environmental advantages. And most importantly, 5 young men who were about to learn why Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez had earned the nickname Ghost during her years with SEAL Team 6. Derek returned to his friends, and Sarah could see them huddled in intense conversation. Their body language suggested disagreement about tactics, with some arguing for immediate action while others counseled patience. But she knew that patience would not win out among young men who had been drinking for hours and building themselves up for confrontation. She had perhaps 10 minutes before they made their move. Sarah finished her second beer and considered ordering a third, but decided against it. She needed all her faculties sharp for what was coming, and even small amounts of alcohol could affect reaction time and decision-making ability. Instead, she signaled the waitress for a glass of water and continued her analysis of the tactical situation. The other patrons in Murphy's bar had begun to sense the tension building in the room. Conversations had become more subdued, and several people had left earlier than they might have under normal circumstances. Those who remained were mostly older military personnel who recognized the signs of impending trouble and were positioning themselves accordingly. Some moved closer to the exits, preparing to leave if violence erupted. Others shifted to positions where they could intervene if necessary, their service instincts overriding their desire to avoid civilian entanglements. A few simply waited and watched, curious to see how the situation would resolve itself. The bartender had noticed the tension as well and was probably debating whether to call security or handle the situation herself. Sarah hoped she would choose the former, though she suspected that any security response would arrive too late to prevent whatever was about to happen. At 10:15, Derek stood up again and began walking toward her booth, this time accompanied by two of his friends. The other two remained at their table, probably positioned to cut off a retreat if she tried to flee toward the exit. Basic pack hunting tactics, Sarah noted with professional interest. Surround the prey, cut off escape routes, and apply overwhelming force to ensure quick submission. It was exactly the kind of strategy that would work against an ordinary civilian woman who had no training in close-quarters combat. Unfortunately for Derek and his friends, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez was anything but ordinary. The three young men approached Sarah's table with the confidence of wolves closing in on isolated prey. Derek led the group, flanked by two recruits who looked remarkably similar to him in build and bearing. All three had the kind of physical development that came from months of military training, and their movements suggested coordination born from shared experience in basic training exercises. Sarah remained focused on the television screen, where the Cowboys had just scored another touchdown to extend their lead over the Eagles. She appeared completely absorbed in the game, oblivious to the approaching threat. Her posture was relaxed, her breathing steady, and her hands rested casually on the table beside her water glass. To any observer, she looked like an ordinary woman about to become the victim of a coordinated assault by three much larger and stronger opponents. The appearance was precisely what Sarah intended. "Change your mind yet?" Derek asked as he slid into the booth across from her, while his two companions positioned themselves to block her exit from the booth. Sarah looked up from the game with an expression of mild annoyance, as if she were being interrupted by persistent door-to-door salesmen rather than threatened by potential rapists. "About what?" she asked. Derek's companions exchanged glances that suggested they were impressed by their target's apparent naivety. The shorter of the two, a stocky recruit with arms covered in fresh tattoos, leaned forward with a predatory grin. "About being more social," he said. "We're just looking to have some fun tonight, and you look like you could use some company." The third recruit, tall and lean with the kind of pale complexion that suggested Midwestern origins, nodded agreement while his eyes conducted an obvious appraisal of Sarah's body. "Yeah, we could show you a real good time. Better than sitting here alone watching football." Sarah considered their words with the same attention she might give to a weather report. Interesting information, but not particularly relevant to her immediate concerns. She was much more focused on their positioning, their probable intentions, and the tactical options available to her in the confined space of the booth. "I appreciate the offer," she said finally, "but I'm really not interested in company tonight. I just want to finish my drink and watch the game." Her rejection was delivered in the same calm, polite tone she had used earlier, as if she genuinely believed that reasonable people would accept her decision and leave her alone. The three recruits found her continued resistance both frustrating and amusing. Derek leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table in a gesture designed to emphasize his size and strength. "See, here's the thing. You keep saying no, but I don't think you really mean it. I think you're just playing hard to get." The tattooed recruit nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, women always say no at first. It's like a game or something. They want you to work for it." Sarah felt a familiar coldness settle over her, the same emotional detachment that had served her well during combat operations in hostile territory. These three young men had just revealed themselves to be potential rapists, the kind of predators who interpreted rejection as encouragement and consent as something to be overcome rather than respected. She had hoped they were simply aggressive and poorly socialized, the kind of recruits who could be redirected toward more appropriate behavior with proper leadership and guidance. But their words had eliminated any doubt about their intentions and their character. They were predators, and They had chosen the wrong prey. I see, Sarah said, her voice remaining conversationally calm. So when I say no, you hear yes. Is that correct? The tall recruit laughed, apparently delighted by what he interpreted as playful banter. Now you're getting it. We knew you were smarter than you looked. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if she were genuinely considering their proposition rather than calculating the optimal sequence for neutralizing three armed opponents in a confined space. And if I continue to say no, she continued, what exactly did you plan to do about it? The directness of her question caught them off guard. They had expected continued resistance followed by gradual submission as the reality of their situation became clear to her. They had not anticipated clinical interest in their tactical planning. Derek recovered first, his expression hardening as he realized that his preferred approach of gradual intimidation was not producing the desired results. Well, I guess that depends on how smart you really are. We outnumber you 3-1, and our friends over there make it 5-1. This can go easy or it can go hard, but either way, you're coming with us when we leave. The threat was now explicit and unambiguous. They intended to remove her from the bar by force and take her to a location where they could assault her without interruption. It was exactly the escalation that Sarah had been expecting, and it triggered protocols that had been drilled into her through years of training. She was no longer a civilian woman trying to enjoy a quiet evening. She was a Navy SEAL operating behind enemy lines, surrounded by hostile forces who intended to cause her serious harm. The change in her mental state was invisible to the three recruits, but it was as dramatic as the difference between a house cat and a tiger. Every sense became hyperacute, every muscle prepared for explosive action, and every tactical option crystallized into perfect clarity. Sarah glanced toward the two recruits who had remained at their original table, confirming that they were still in position to cut off a retreat toward the main exit. She noted the position of other bar patrons, identifying potential allies and civilians who might be endangered if the situation turned violent. She calculated angles, distances, and the probable sequence of events once hostilities commenced. Most importantly, she evaluated her three immediate opponents and identified their most likely weaknesses and tactical errors. Derek was clearly the leader, which meant he was the primary threat, but also the most predictable. He would probably attempt to grab her first, expecting his size and strength to overwhelm any resistance she might offer. His two companions would follow his lead, moving to support him once he initiated contact. The tattooed recruit was showing signs of steroid use in his overdeveloped upper body and aggressive demeanor. He would be strong, but probably slow, and his bulk would work against him in the confined space of the booth. More importantly, his obvious muscle mass suggested someone who had relied on physical intimidation to resolve conflicts, which meant he would be unprepared for an opponent who possessed superior technique and training. The tall recruit appeared to be the least physically imposing of the three, but his relaxed confidence suggested either extensive fighting experience or complete ignorance of what real combat entailed. Sarah suspected the latter, which made him potentially the most dangerous if he panicked and resorted to weapons. You know, Sarah said, taking a sip of water while her mind completed its tactical analysis, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about this being a rough place with dangerous people. Derek smiled, apparently interpreting her words as the beginning of her capitulation. Yeah? What about it? Well, you were right about there being dangerous people here, Sarah continued, her voice still maintaining its conversational calm. You just made one critical error in your assessment. The tattooed recruit leaned closer, his expression eager. Yeah? What's that? Sarah set down her water glass and looked each of them in the eye before responding. When she spoke, her voice carried a subtle change in tone that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone with military experience. It was the voice of a combat veteran who had killed enemy soldiers and was prepared to do so again if necessary. You assumed that dangerous person was someone else. The three recruits blinked in confusion, their alcohol-fogged minds struggling to process her words. They had expected tears, pleading, or resigned submission. They had not expected calm analysis delivered in a tone that suggested they might have miscalculated their tactical situation. Derek was the first to recognize that something had changed, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. Sarah's posture hadn't shifted. Her hands were still resting casually on the table, and Her expression remained neutral. But something in her eyes, some subtle shift in her bearing, suggested that the dynamics of their encounter had fundamentally altered. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice carrying the first hint of uncertainty he had displayed all evening. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since they had approached her table, the expression reached her eyes. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just realized that her prey had walked directly into her trap. "It means," she said quietly, "that you gentlemen have made several very serious mistakes tonight." The tall recruit looked around nervously, as if expecting additional threats to materialize from the other patrons in the bar. "What kind of mistakes?" Sarah's smile widened slightly. "First, you assumed that physical appearance determines capability. Second, you assumed that being outnumbered automatically provides an advantage. Third, you assumed that I would be intimidated by threats of violence." She paused to take another sip of water, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "But your biggest mistake was assuming that I'm a victim." Derek's predatory confidence was beginning to crack as he struggled to understand how the situation had shifted so dramatically. He had approached what appeared to be a helpless target, but somehow found himself engaged in a conversation that felt more like a briefing than an interrogation. "Listen, lady," he said, trying to reassert his dominance through volume and aggression. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but you're in no position to make threats. We can do this easy or we can do it hard, but you're coming with us." To emphasize his point, he reached across the table and grabbed Sarah's wrist, intending to demonstrate his physical control over the situation. It was exactly the move she had been waiting for. Sarah's response was so fast that the casual observer might have missed it entirely. Derek's reaching hand was suddenly trapped in a joint lock that sent bolts of agony up his arm and into his shoulder. His wrist was twisted at an angle that threatened to snap bone, and any attempt to pull away only increased the pressure on joints that were not designed to bend in that direction. The technique was a basic Aikido wrist lock, something Sarah could have performed successfully even before her SEAL training. But it was executed with the precision and control of someone who had used similar techniques to subdue enemy combatants in life-or-death situations. Derek's face went white with pain and shock as he found himself completely immobilized by a grip that appeared almost casual. His two companions stared in confusion, their alcohol-dulled minds struggling to process what they were seeing. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice remaining conversationally calm, despite the fact that she now controlled one of her attackers through applied leverage. "You and your friends are going to return to your table, finish your drinks quietly, and leave this establishment without bothering anyone else." Derek tried to pull away and immediately regretted the decision as fresh waves of pain shot through his arm. The joint lock was positioned perfectly to maximize discomfort while minimizing the risk of permanent injury, a technique that required both extensive training and considerable experience to execute properly. "You're hurting me," he gasped, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine distress. Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his observation. "Yes, I am. And I can hurt you much worse if you make me continue this conversation." The tattooed recruit finally processed what was happening and moved to help his friend, reaching for Sarah with hands that probably outweighed her entire arm. It was exactly the response she had anticipated. Sarah released Derek's wrist and flowed seamlessly into her next technique, using the confined space of the booth to her advantage rather than allowing it to restrict her movement. The tattooed recruit found his reaching arm trapped in an armbar that hyperextended his elbow joint and put tremendous pressure on his shoulder socket. The technique was performed so smoothly that it appeared almost balletic, a practice motion that required no conscious thought or effort. Sarah had moved from controlling one opponent to controlling another without releasing her grip or changing her seated position. "As I was saying," she continued, now holding the tattooed recruit in a submission hold that could dislocate his shoulder with very little additional pressure, "you're going to return to your table and behave like civilized human beings." The tall recruit backed away from a booth, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that suggested he had finally begun to grasp the reality of their situation. "Look, lady, we don't want any trouble. We were just having some fun." Sarah looked at him with an expression of genuine curiosity. "Fun? You consider threatening to rape someone fun?" Her words were delivered in the same conversational tone she might use to discuss the weather, but Their impact on the three recruits was devastating. Sarah had just stated explicitly what they had only implied, forcing them to confront the reality of their intentions and behavior. Derek was massaging his wrist, trying to restore circulation to fingers that had gone numb during the joint lock. His face was pale with shock and pain, but also with the dawning realization that he had seriously underestimated his intended victim. "We weren't going to rape anybody," he protested weakly. "We just wanted to have some drinks and maybe get to know you better." Sarah released the tattooed recruit and allowed him to slump back against the booth wall, cradling his injured arm. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had interrogated enemy prisoners and was accustomed to separating truth from deception. "Really? Then what did you mean when you said I was coming with you whether I wanted to or not? What did you mean when you said it could go easy or hard? What exactly did you plan to do with me once you got me alone?" The three recruits exchanged glances that confirmed Sarah's assessment of their intentions. They had been caught in their own lies, exposed as the predators they had revealed themselves to be. Their silence was more damning than any confession could have been. "I thought so," Sarah said with satisfaction. "Now, here's what happens next. You three are going to walk back to your table, collect your two friends, and leave this bar immediately. You're never going to return here, and you're never going to approach another woman in any bar with the kind of intentions you brought to me tonight." Derek found his voice first, though it lacked any of the swagger he had displayed earlier. "And if we don't?" Sarah's smile returned, and this time it carried the promise of violence that went far beyond simple joint locks and submission holds. "If you don't, then I'm going to stop being polite about this situation. And trust me when I tell you that you really don't want to see what happens when I stop being polite." The three recruits looked at her with expressions that suggested they were beginning to understand that their evening had taken a dramatic and unexpected turn. The woman they had selected as easy prey had revealed herself to be something far more dangerous than they had imagined possible. But alcohol and male pride were powerful forces, and Derek's humiliation was beginning to transform in anger. He was a military-trained warrior who had just been publicly defeated by a woman half his size. His reputation among his peers, his self-image as a dominant male, and his entire worldview had been shattered in the space of a few minutes. "You think you're tough?" he asked, his voice rising with indignation. "You got lucky with some martial arts moves, but there are 5 of us and 1 of you. You can't fight all of us at once." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if she were genuinely considering his tactical assessment. "You know, you raise an interesting point. 5 against 1 does seem like poor odds." Derek's confidence began to return as he interpreted her words as acknowledgement of her disadvantageous position. "That's right. So maybe you should reconsider your attitude." "Poor odds for you. I mean," Sarah continued calmly. "See, the thing about fighting multiple opponents is that most people have never been trained to do it properly. They think it's just a matter of being outnumbered, but it's really about understanding angles, timing, and target prioritization." The tattooed recruit, who was still massaging his injured shoulder, looked at her with genuine confusion. "What the hell does that mean?" Sarah's smile widened, and for the first time all evening, she appeared to be genuinely enjoying herself. "It means that your friend Derek is about to learn the difference between basic training and advanced combat instruction." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge that could no longer be ignored or deflected. The 5 recruits had come to Murphy's bar looking for easy victims and had instead encountered someone whose very presence seemed to alter the fundamental rules of engagement. Derek looked toward his friends at the other table, seeking reinforcement for a confrontation that had spiraled far beyond his ability to control. But what he saw in their faces was not the support and encouragement he needed. Instead, he saw the same doubt and uncertainty that was beginning to eat away at his own confidence. Because even from across the room, even through the haze of alcohol and testosterone, they had begun to sense what Derek was just now beginning to understand. They had not found a victim tonight. They had found a predator. The 2 recruits who had remained at their table across the bar were beginning to sense that something had gone terribly wrong with their carefully planned assault. They could see their 3 friends engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with their target, but the body language was all wrong for a successful intimidation. Derek should have been leaning forward in a position of dominance, with a woman cowering under the combined pressure of 3 larger opponents. Instead, he appeared to be massaging his wrist while maintaining a respectful distance from their target. His two companions looked even worse, with one holding his shoulder and the other backing away from the booth entirely. "This doesn't look right," muttered the shorter of the two remaining recruits, a compact young man named Tommy who had earned a reputation for viciousness during hand-to-hand combat training. "Derek's supposed to have this handled by now." His companion, a lanky recruit named Jake whose specialty was weapons maintenance, nodded agreement while trying to make sense of what they were seeing. "Maybe she's got a weapon. Could be she pulled a knife or something." Tommy studied the tableau more carefully, noting the positioning and the obvious tension around the corner booth. If she had a weapon, they'd be backing off more than this. This looks like something else. Both men had been drinking heavily, but their concern for their friends was beginning to cut through the alcohol haze. They had planned this assault together, bonding over shared stories about their conquests with civilian women who couldn't resist the appeal of military uniforms and training. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of their graduation from basic training, a demonstration of their newfound power and status. But something was clearly going wrong with their plan. "Should we go help them?" Jake asked, his voice uncertain. Tommy considered the question while studying their target more carefully. She was seated calmly in the booth, appearing to conduct a normal conversation with Derek and his companions. But there was something about her posture and bearing that seemed different from the helpless victim they had identified earlier in the evening. "Let's wait and see what happens," Tommy decided. Derek said he could handle one woman on his own. If he needs help, he'll signal us. But even as he spoke, Tommy was beginning to suspect that their assessment of the situation had been fundamentally flawed. They had selected their target based on the assumption that a woman sitting alone must be vulnerable and defenseless. That assumption was now being challenged by evidence that none of them were prepared to accept. Back at the corner booth, Sarah was conducting her own assessment of the remaining tactical situation. She had successfully neutralized the immediate threat from the three recruits in front of her, but the two across the room still represented potential problems. They were positioned to intercept her if she tried to leave through the main exit, and their distance gave them time to react to whatever techniques she might use against their companions. More importantly, the confrontation had attracted the attention of other patrons in Murphy's bar. Some were moving closer, drawn by curiosity or concern for her safety. Others were edging toward the exits, unwilling to be caught in whatever violence might erupt. A few appeared to be military personnel who recognized the signs of impending combat, and were positioning themselves to intervene if necessary. Sarah appreciated their concern, but civilian involvement would only complicate an already delicate situation. She needed to resolve this confrontation quickly and decisively, with minimal collateral damage, and no witnesses who might ask uncomfortable questions about her capabilities. "Derek," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the bar, "I need you to make a decision right now." The young recruit looked up from his injured wrist, his eyes reflecting a mixture of pain, confusion, and growing anger. "What kind of decision?" Sarah's expression became serious, and when she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable authority of a combat veteran addressing subordinate personnel. "You can accept that you've made a serious mistake tonight, apologize for your behavior, and leave quietly with your dignity intact. Or you can escalate the situation and discover exactly why picking fights with strangers is generally considered a bad idea." Her words were delivered without emotion or theatricality, but they carried the weight of absolute certainty. She was not making threats or attempting to bluff her way out of a difficult situation. She was stating facts about what would happen if the current trajectory continued. Derek looked toward his friends across the room, seeking support for his damaged ego and guidance for his next move. But what he saw in their faces was not the encouragement he needed. Tommy and Jake were staring at their table with expressions that suggested they were beginning to question their entire assessment of the evening's events. "You don't understand," Derek said finally, his voice carrying a note of desperation that hadn't been there before. "We can't just walk away from this. Do you know what that would do to our reputation? We'd be laughingstocks." Sarah studied his face with genuine interest, recognizing the psychological trap that often ensnared young military personnel who confused aggression with strength and violence with competence. Derek and his friends had constructed an identity based on their ability to intimidate civilians, and backing down from a single woman would shatter that identity completely. "I see," she said thoughtfully. So this isn't really about me at all, is it? This is about your self-image and how you think other people perceive you. The tattooed recruit, who had been silent since his encounter with the armbar, looked up with genuine confusion. What does that mean? Sarah turned her attention to him with the patience of an instructor addressing a particularly slow student. It means that you're not actually interested in me as a person. You're interested in what assaulting me would prove about your power and dominance. I'm just a prop in your performance of masculinity. Her psychological analysis cut deeper than any physical technique she had used, exposing the fundamental insecurity that drove their predatory behavior. The three young men found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths about their motivations and character that went far beyond the immediate tactical situation. That's not true, Derek protested, but his voice lacked conviction. We just wanted to have some fun. No, Sarah replied with absolute certainty. You wanted to feel powerful. You wanted to prove to yourselves and each other that you could take whatever you wanted from whoever you wanted. The problem is that you chose someone who doesn't fit your victim profile. She paused to let her words sink in before continuing. See, the thing about bullies is that they only pick fights they're sure they can win. When they encounter real resistance, they either back down or escalate to weapons. Which category do you think you fall into? The question hung in the air between them like a landmine waiting to be triggered. Sarah had just challenged not only their immediate tactical situation, but their entire worldview and self-image. They could accept her assessment and walk away with their tails between their legs, or they could prove her wrong through overwhelming force. For young men whose entire sense of self-worth was tied to their physical prowess and military training, it wasn't really a choice at all. Derek looked toward his friends across the room and made a gesture that Sarah recognized immediately. He was calling for backup, summoning reinforcements for an assault that would overwhelm any resistance she might offer. It was exactly the escalation she had been expecting, and it meant that the time for conversation had come to an end. Tommy and Jake stood up from their table and began moving toward the corner booth, their movements suggesting coordination born from shared training and mutual purpose. They spread out as they approached, positioning themselves to cut off her escape routes and prevent her from using their companions as human shields. Sarah noted their formation with professional interest. They were executing a basic small unit tactic designed to overwhelm a single opponent through coordinated assault from multiple directions. It was the kind of maneuver that would work perfectly against an ordinary civilian who lacked combat training and experience. Unfortunately for all 5 recruits, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez possessed combat training and experience that went far beyond anything they had encountered in basic training. She finished her water and set the glass down carefully, her movements betraying no sense of urgency or concern. To any observer, she might have been preparing to pay her tab and leave rather than preparing to defend herself against 5 attackers who intended to drag her from the bar and assault her. Last chance, Derek, she said calmly. Call off your friends and walk away. Right now, Derek's response was to slide further into the booth, positioning himself to grab her if she tried to escape while his friends approached from different angles. His expression had hardened into the kind of determined aggression that Sarah had seen in enemy combatants who had decided to fight to the death rather than surrender. You had your chance to do this easy, he replied. Now we're going to do it hard. Sarah nodded acceptance of his decision while her mind shifted into combat mode. The social interaction phase of this encounter was officially over. What followed would be a purely tactical exercise in neutralizing multiple hostile opponents in a confined space with civilian bystanders present. She had trained for exactly this scenario hundreds of times during her SEAL qualification courses and subsequent advanced training. Multiple attackers, confined space, need for rapid neutralization without permanent injury to opponents or bystanders. It was a classic close-quarters combat problem with well-established solutions. The difference was that her previous training had always involved fellow military personnel who understood that they were participating in an exercise. Tonight's opponents had no idea what they were about to experience. Tommy reached the booth first, approaching from the left side, where he could support Derek while blocking her retreat toward the wall. He was moving with the confidence of someone who had never encountered serious resistance to his physical dominance, and his technique reflected basic hand-to-hand combat training rather than advanced close-quarters combat experience. Sarah waited until he was within arm's reach before moving. Her first technique was a simple palm strike to his solar plexus, delivered with just enough force to disrupt his breathing without causing permanent injury. Tommy doubled over involuntarily, his diaphragm spasming as his body struggled to process the unexpected impact. Before he could recover, Sarah flowed into a knee strike to his face that sent him crashing backward into the adjacent table. The move was executed with surgical precision, designed to neutralize him as a threat without inflicting injuries that would require emergency medical treatment. Jake witnessed his friend's sudden incapacitation and hesitated, his alcohol-clouded mind struggling to process what he had just seen. In that moment of hesitation, Sarah demonstrated why hesitation was fatal in close-quarters combat. She stood up from the booth for the first time since the confrontation began, her movements so fluid that it appeared almost casual. But the change in her positioning transformed the tactical situation completely, giving her access to techniques and angles that had been impossible while seated. Jake found himself facing someone whose very presence seemed to alter the physical laws governing the confined space around the booth. Where Tommy had been confident and aggressive, Jake became uncertain and defensive, his body language betraying his recognition that he was out of his depth. "I don't want to fight you," he said, backing away with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Sarah studied him with genuine interest. Of all 5 recruits, Jake was the first to recognize that the situation had escalated beyond his ability to control or understand. His willingness to back down suggested that he might possess enough intelligence to learn from this experience. "Then, don't," she replied simply. But Derek had no intention of allowing his friends to abandon the assault they had planned together. "Get her," he shouted, lunging from the booth in an attempt to grab Sarah from behind. It was exactly the move Sarah had been waiting for. Derek's attack came from her blind side with enough force to knock down an ordinary woman, but it also committed him to a trajectory that put him in perfect position for a counterattack that would end the confrontation permanently. Sarah stepped slightly to her left, allowing Derek's momentum to carry him past her while she grabbed his extended arm and used his own force against him. The resulting throw sent him crashing into the wall beside the booth with enough impact to rattle the pictures hanging there. The technique was a basic Aikido throw that redirected an attacker's energy while requiring minimal effort from the defender. But it was executed with the precision and timing of someone who had used similar techniques in life-or-death combat situations. Derek hit the wall hard and slumped to the floor, momentarily stunned by the impact. He wasn't seriously injured, but he was definitely out of the fight for at least the next several minutes. That left 2 opponents still mobile, plus the tattooed recruit who was still nursing his injured shoulder from the earlier encounter. Sarah evaluated the remaining threats while positioning herself to deal with multiple attackers simultaneously. Jake had continued backing away during Derek's failed assault, his retreat taking him toward the main area of the bar, where other patrons were watching the confrontation with growing interest and concern. His body language suggested that he had no intention of continuing the fight, but Sarah couldn't afford to ignore him while dealing with the remaining threats. The tattooed recruit was still in the booth, cradling his injured arm and staring at Sarah with an expression that mixed pain with genuine bewilderment. He had been present for the entire confrontation, had experienced her capabilities firsthand, and had watched her systematically dismantle his friend's coordinated assault. But Tommy was already recovering from his encounter with the solar plexus strike and knee to the face. Blood was streaming from his nose, and his breathing was still labored, but he was standing upright and looking for an opportunity to rejoin the fight. "This isn't over," Tommy said, his voice thick with blood and rage. "You got lucky, but luck runs out." Sarah studied him with the detached interest of a scientist observing an interesting specimen. Tommy had just witnessed her defeat 3 of his companions using techniques that went far beyond basic self-defense, but he was still convinced that the confrontation would eventually turn in his favor. "Actually," Sarah said calmly, "luck has nothing to do with it. What you just witnessed was the application of superior training against inferior opponents. The outcome was never in doubt." Her words carried the confidence of absolute truth, delivered without arrogance or boasting, but with the certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. Tommy had been outclassed from the beginning of the confrontation, and his continued resistance would only result in additional pain and humiliation. But young men who had built their identities around physical dominance were often incapable of accepting such realities until they had been demonstrated beyond any possible doubt. Tommy wiped blood from his nose and assumed what he probably thought was a fighting stance. His technique was textbook basic training, adequate for sparring exercises, but completely inadequate for facing someone with advanced combat training. "Let's see how tough you are when someone knows what they're doing," he growled. Sarah almost smiled at his confidence. Of all the mistakes the 5 recruits had made that evening, Tommy's assumption that he knew what he was doing was perhaps the most dangerous to his own well-being. Because Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when basic training encountered advanced combat experience in an uncontrolled environment. And unlike the controlled sparring exercises that had built Tommy's confidence, this demonstration would be conducted at full speed and full contact with no safety equipment and no referees to stop the action when things went wrong. Tommy had asked to see how tough she was when facing someone who knew what they were doing. He was about to get his answer. Tommy advanced towards Sarah with the kind of aggressive confidence that only came from months of controlled sparring against opponents who were following the same rules he had learned. His stance was textbook basic training. His movements telegraphed his intentions clearly, and his technique reflected everything wrong with military hand-to-hand combat instruction that emphasized aggression over tactics. Sarah remained motionless as he approached, her posture relaxed, and her hands at her sides. To any observer unfamiliar with advanced combat training, she appeared to be frozen by fear or uncertainty. But to anyone with real experience in close-quarters combat, her stillness was the calm before a devastating storm. Tommy threw the first punch with all the power and technique that basic training had taught him. It was a strong, fast, well-executed strike that would have been devastatingly effective against an ordinary opponent. The problem was that Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez was anything but ordinary. She moved just enough to let his punch pass harmlessly by her head, then stepped inside his guard and delivered a short, sharp elbow strike to his ribs. The technique was executed with surgical precision, targeting the floating ribs that would cause maximum pain and disorientation without inflicting permanent damage. Tommy's breath exploded from his lungs in a whoosh of agony as his body processed the unexpected impact. Before he could recover, Sarah had moved behind him and applied a blood choke that cut off circulation to his brain with mathematical efficiency. The choke was a basic Brazilian jiu-jitsu technique that Sarah could have performed in her sleep, but it was applied with the kind of precise pressure that only came from years of experience in life-or-death situations. Tommy had perhaps 10 seconds of consciousness remaining before his brain would shut down from lack of oxygen. He struggled frantically against her grip, his hands clawing at her arm, while his feet kicked uselessly at empty air. But Sarah's positioning was perfect, her leverage was unbreakable, and her technique was flawless. Tommy's struggles only served to accelerate the process by increasing his oxygen consumption. "Sleep," Sarah whispered in his ear, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had performed this technique countless times before. Tommy's struggles weakened, then ceased entirely as his brain succumbed to oxygen deprivation. Sarah held the choke for exactly 3 seconds after he lost consciousness, ensuring that he would remain unconscious for several minutes without suffering any permanent injury. She lowered his limp body to the floor with the same care she might show when moving a sleeping child, checking his pulse and breathing to confirm that he was stable before turning her attention to the remaining threats. The entire sequence had taken less than 15 seconds from Tommy's first punch to his unconsciousness. To the other patrons in Murphy's bar, it had appeared almost balletic in its efficiency and precision. One moment Tommy had been advancing with aggressive confidence, and the next he was sleeping peacefully on the floor. Jake, who had been backing away throughout the confrontation, now stood pressed against the far wall with his eyes wide with shock and terror. He had watched Sarah systematically dismantle 4 of his friends using techniques that seemed to violate every assumption he had made about physical combat. "I surrender," he said quickly, his voice cracking with fear. "I don't want any part of this. I was just drinking with them. I didn't know they were planning to do anything illegal." Sarah studied him with the same analytical attention she had given his companions, evaluating his sincerity and determining whether he represented a continued threat. His body language suggested genuine fear and remorse, but she had learned through bitter experience that fear could make desperate people dangerous in unpredictable ways. "Turn around and place your hands against the wall," she commanded, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Jake complied immediately, spreading his legs and assuming the position he had probably seen in countless police procedural shows. Sarah approached him carefully, maintaining situational awareness while checking him for weapons and ensuring that he wasn't preparing to launch a surprise attack. She found a folding knife clipped to his pocket, which she removed and set aside. The blade was small and legal, probably intended for utility purposes rather than combat, but any weapon could be dangerous in desperate hands. "What's your name?" Sarah asked as she completed her search. "Jake Morrison," he replied, his voice muffled by his position against the wall. "Look, I know this looks bad, but I wasn't part of whatever they were planning to do to you. I was just drinking with them." Sarah considered his words while maintaining her position behind him. Jake's claim might be true, but it was also the standard defense used by accomplices who wanted to distance themselves from criminal activity after it had gone wrong. "But you didn't try to stop them," she pointed out. "You watched them harass other women throughout the evening, and you positioned yourself to cut off my escape when they approached my table." Jake's shoulders slumped as he recognized the accuracy of her assessment. "You're right. I should have said something. I should have left when I realized what they were planning. But I was drunk, and they were my friends, and I didn't want to cause problems." His admission carried the ring of truth, and Sarah found herself genuinely curious about his background and motivations. Unlike his companions, Jake seemed capable of recognizing his mistakes and accepting responsibility for his actions. "Turn around slowly," she instructed. "Keep your hands visible." Jake complied carefully, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. When he faced her, Sarah could see that his fear was genuine, but not paralyzing. He was scared of her capabilities, but he was also processing the evening's events and beginning to understand their implications. "How old are you, Jake?" Sarah asked. 21, he replied. "I graduated basic training 3 weeks ago. This was supposed to be a celebration before we reported to our first assignments." Sarah nodded, understanding. Jake and his friends were barely adults, thrust into an adult world with adult responsibilities and adult consequences for their actions. Military training had given them physical capabilities and a sense of brotherhood, but it hadn't provided them with the judgment or character necessary to use those capabilities responsibly. "Where are you being assigned?" she continued. "Naval Air Station Pensacola," Jake answered. "Aviation Maintenance School. I'm training to work on fighter aircraft." The information painted a clearer picture of Jake's situation. He was a young man who had just completed the most challenging experience of his life, preparing for a career that would require technical precision and absolute reliability. His association with tonight's predators might have been a matter of circumstance rather than character. "Jake," Sarah said quietly, "do you understand what your friends were planning to do to me tonight?" His face reddened with shame as he nodded. "Yeah, I understand. And I understand that you could have called the police and had us all arrested. Or you could have seriously hurt us instead of just stopping us." Sarah was impressed by his insight. Unlike his companions, Jake seemed capable of grasping not only what had happened, but what could have happened if the situation had been handled differently. "So what happens now?" he asked. It was an excellent question, and one that Sarah had been considering throughout the confrontation. 5 young military recruits had attempted to assault a Navy SEAL in a bar full of witnesses. The situation presented multiple complications that went far beyond simple criminal charges. If she reported the incident through official channels, it would trigger investigations that might reveal her true identity and compromise ongoing operations. If she involved civilian law enforcement, 5 young men would face criminal charges that would destroy their military careers before they had even begun. But if she simply let them go, she would be enabling behavior that would almost certainly escalate into more serious crimes in the future. "That depends," Sarah replied finally, "on whether you and your friends are capable of learning from tonight's experience." Before Jake could respond, Derek began stirring on the floor, where he had been unconscious since his encounter with the wall. He groaned and attempted to sit up, his movements uncoordinated and his expression confused. "What happened?" Derek asked, his voice slurred with disorientation. "Where am I?" Sarah moved to where he could see her clearly, while maintaining her position to respond to any renewed aggression. "You're in Murphy's bar, Derek. You attempted to assault me, and I defended myself. Your friends are in various stages of recovery around the room." Derek's memory appeared to return gradually as he took in the scene around him. Tommy was still unconscious on the floor, though his breathing remained steady and strong. The tattooed recruit was sitting in the booth holding his shoulder and staring at Sarah with something approaching awe. Jake was standing against the wall with his hands visible, obviously under Sarah's control. "You did this?" Derek asked, his voice carrying disbelief despite the evidence before him. "I did," Sarah confirmed. "The question now is what we do about it." Derek attempted to stand and immediately regretted the decision as pain shot through his head and back. His collision with the wall had left him with what was probably a mild concussion and extensive bruising, but nothing that required immediate medical attention. "I don't understand," he said, slumping back to a seated position on the floor. "You're just a woman. How'd you do this to all of us?" Sarah almost smiled at his continued inability to process what had happened. Even after being systematically defeated along with his friends, Derek was still struggling to accept that a woman could possess superior combat capabilities. "I'm not just a woman, Derek," she replied. "I'm a woman with 8 years of advanced military training in close-quarters combat, survival, and warfare. What you experienced tonight was the difference between basic training and professional competence." Her words penetrated Derek's confusion like a physical blow. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to grasp that he and his friends had not been defeated by luck or circumstance, but by someone whose capabilities far exceeded their own. "What branch?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered her answer carefully. Revealing her true assignment would violate operational security and potentially compromise classified information. But providing some explanation seemed necessary to help these young men understand the magnitude of their mistake. "Navy," she said finally. "Special operations." The words hit Derek like a sledgehammer. Special operations meant SEAL teams or similar elite units whose training and capabilities were legendary within the military community. He and his friends hadn't attempted to assault an ordinary woman. They had attacked one of the most highly trained warriors in the American military. "Oh God," Derek whispered, his face pale with the realization of what could have happened if Sarah had chosen to respond with lethal force rather than restraint. "We could have been killed." "Yes," Sarah agreed simply. "You could have been." Tommy began to regain consciousness, his movements slow and confused as his brain processed the return of oxygen flow. Sarah moved to check on him while maintaining awareness of the other recruits' positions and mental states. "Easy," she said as Tommy tried to sit up too quickly. "You were unconscious for a few minutes. Take your time and let your body recover." Tommy blinked rapidly, trying to focus his vision and piece together his recent memories. When he saw Sarah kneeling beside him, his first instinct was to recoil in fear. "Don't hurt me," he pleaded, his earlier aggression completely replaced by genuine terror. Sarah's expression softened slightly as she recognized the psychological trauma that her defensive actions had inflicted. Tommy had entered the evening believing himself to be a dangerous predator, only to discover that he was completely helpless against someone with real combat training. "I'm not going to hurt you," she assured him. "The fighting is over. Everyone is safe, including you." Tommy's relief was palpable as he processed her words. He had expected continued violence, perhaps even lethal retribution for his earlier behavior. The fact that Sarah was showing concern for his well-being despite his attempted assault was beyond his ability to comprehend. "Why aren't you calling the police?" Tommy asked. "Why aren't you having us arrested?" It was the same question that Jake had asked, and it reflected the psychological disorientation that all 5 recruits were experiencing. They had attempted to commit a serious crime and had been defeated by their intended victim, but instead of facing criminal prosecution, they found themselves receiving medical attention and reasonable treatment. Sarah considered her response while evaluating the overall situation. 5 young men lay or sat around her in various stages of physical and psychological recovery. None of them appear to represent an ongoing threat, but all of them needed to understand the lessons that tonight's experience should teach them. Because, she said finally, I believe that people can learn from their mistakes if they're given the opportunity to do so. She stood and moved to address all 5 recruits simultaneously, her voice carrying the authority of a commanding officer addressing subordinate personnel. Tonight you learned several important lessons. First, you learned that appearances can be deceiving and that assumptions about capability based on gender or physical appearance can be dangerous. Second, you learned that predatory behavior against civilians will eventually encounter someone who can and will stop you permanently. Third, you learned that military training creates a responsibility to protect, not exploit, those who cannot protect themselves. The 5 young men listened to her words with the attention of students receiving instruction that might save their lives. Even Derek, who had been the most aggressive throughout the evening, seemed to recognize that Sarah was offering them something far more valuable than punishment. But, most importantly, Sarah continued, you learned that you have a choice about what kind of men you want to be. You can use your training and capabilities to become predators who prey on the innocent, or you can become protectors who defend those who need defending. She paused to let her words sink in before delivering her final message. What you do with tonight's lessons will determine not only your military careers, but the kind of people you become. Choose wisely, because next time you might not encounter someone who believes in second chances. The weight of her words settled over the 5 recruits like a physical presence. They had come to Murphy's bar as predators looking for easy victims, and they were leaving as chastened young men who had glimpsed both their own capacity for evil and the consequences that such capacity would eventually bring. But whether they would learn from the experience or simply become more careful in selecting their targets remained to be seen. Sarah had given them the opportunity to choose a better path. The rest was up to them. 6 months after that November night at Murphy's bar, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez stood on the quarterdeck of the USS Bataan, watching Norfolk's skyline fade into the morning haze as the amphibious assault ship made its way toward open water. The administrative leave that had kept her grounded was finally over, and she was returning to active duty with a new assignment that would take her back to the Middle East. The congressional hearing had concluded 3 months earlier with a classified report that cleared her of any wrongdoing in the Syrian operation. The politicians had gotten their headlines, the media had moved on to other scandals, and Sarah was free to return to the work she had trained her entire adult life to perform. But the events at Murphy's bar continued to occupy her thoughts during quiet moments like these. She had made a decision that night to give 5 young men a second chance rather than destroy their careers before they had even begun. The question that haunted her was whether that decision had been the right one. The answer had come in pieces over the intervening months, fragments of information that painted a complex picture of choices made and lessons learned. Jake Morrison had been the first to reach out, sending a carefully worded letter to her through official Navy channels 3 weeks after their encounter. He was excelling in aviation maintenance school at Pensacola, earning top marks in both technical training and military bearing. More importantly, he had taken Sarah's words about becoming a protector rather than a predator to heart. His letter described an incident at a Pensacola bar where he had intervened when a group of older sailors were harassing a young woman. Instead of joining the harassment or ignoring it as he might have done before their encounter, Jake had used his military bearing and training to defuse the situation and ensure the woman's safety. I kept thinking about what you said that night, he wrote, about having a choice about what kind of man I wanted to be. I decided I wanted to be the kind of man who protects people instead of hurting them. The letter also included news about his companions from that evening. Tommy had been transferred to a different training program after failing to meet performance standards at his original assignment. According to Jake, Tommy had struggled with alcohol abuse and disciplinary problems that had eventually resulted in administrative separation from the Navy. Derek had completed his training, but was facing a court-martial for assault charges stemming from an incident with a civilian woman in San Diego. Unlike their encounter with Sarah, Derek's second attempt at predatory behavior had targeted someone who couldn't defend herself and who had no reason to show mercy. The tattooed recruit, whose name Jake revealed as Marcus, had excelled in his assigned specialty, but had been written up multiple times for inappropriate behavior toward female personnel. He He was walking a thin line that would probably result in his separation from the Navy within the year. The fifth recruit, whom Sarah had barely interacted with that night, had simply disappeared from Jake's life after their encounter. Jake suspected that he had transferred to a different service branch or possibly left the military entirely, but he had no definitive information about his fate. Sarah had read Jake's letter with mixed emotions. 2 of the 5 young men appear to have learned from their experience and were building positive military careers. 2 others were following the path that she had feared they would choose, using their training and position to prey on those weaker than themselves. The 5th remained a question mark whose ultimate destination was unknown. It was exactly the kind of outcome that Sarah should have expected from her decision to show mercy rather than seeking justice. Human nature was complex, and people responded to second chances in different ways depending on their character and circumstances. But Jake's transformation from potential predator to active protector suggested that her decision had been worthwhile, even if it hadn't saved all 5 young men from their own worst impulses. 3 months later, Sarah had received additional confirmation that her investment in Jake Morrison was paying dividends. His commanding officer at Pensacola had written a commendation letter describing Jake's exceptional performance and leadership potential. The letter specifically mentioned his intervention in several incidents where his actions had protected junior personnel from harassment and abuse. Petty Officer Morrison has demonstrated exceptional moral courage and leadership in situations where other personnel might have remained silent or uninvolved, the letter stated. His commitment to protecting and defending his fellow sailors regardless of their rank or gender reflects the highest traditions of naval service. Reading those words, Sarah had felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. She had given Jake a choice about the kind of man he wanted to be, and he had chosen to become exactly the kind of sailor that the Navy